Mr. Roth will be introduced by our moderator, Peter Purcell. Peter is, come on up, gentlemen. Peter is the editor of the Milken Institute Review, which, if you've never had the experience of reading it, I strongly suggest you do so. You can read it online, or you can get the Milken Institute Review app. Peter has been, over here. Come on up. He's already trying to get out of it. Peter's been the editor of the review since 1999, its inception. Before that, he was the economics columnist for the New York Times and an assistant professor at Columbia University's Graduate Department of Economics. We're in for a great conversation. Please welcome Alvin Roth and Peter Purcell.
Now, my guess is most of you have already read the little bio for Al Roth. One thing I'd point out to you that's probably not on that bio is that Al Roth is here under false pretenses. He's not an economist. Like many of the best Nobel Prize winners in economics, he's something else. And in this case, he's a PhD in operations research, which is worth thinking about, especially when you counsel your children where to go to graduate school. In any case, I've, over the years, the sort of people who come to forums or read the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times are sort of eager to know what Nobel Prize winners in economics do. What they've achieved that made it possible for them to get a Nobel Prize. And this is kind of tough for me because sometimes I can't help them because I can't describe anything that they've done that has any direct bearing on their lives, on our lives. Though that's not entirely fair in the sense that they may well be building a base of knowledge that will someday matter. But it's frustrating. And sometimes they do things that are very important to you and me, but they're just too arcane to explain. So it's kind of a mess, and you can see the result of that mess if you each year read the little squibs about what the Nobel Prize winners have done in the New York Times. It is completely impossible to understand what they're talking about, and for good reasons. But this is emphatically, I wouldn't have raised this issue otherwise, this is emphatically not the case with Al Roth of Stanford, who's obviously tonight's speaker, who won the prize in 2012. He's a pioneer in the relatively new field of market design, which is at the heart of how to make economies, and far more important, far more broadly, societies work better. What's more, while some of the heavy-duty math that lies beneath the surface is way beyond my competence to explain, most of what he's done is entirely explainable to people who've never taken a course in economics. And that's one of the joys of having him here, because he's going to explain some of that stuff to you. And what he doesn't explain, you're going to read about in his book, which, by the way, is written in English, which is another leap. It's remarkable, actually. That book reads like the wind. And I would probably lie to you a bit about this anyway, because he is our guest. But in this case, it's truly heartfelt. Let me start off. I'm also going to tell you right now and confess that there's too much in this book, and in ways that are too hard to organize for us to have a kind of a conversation where you'll be able to diagram it linearly from beginning to end. What I hope to do is give you a taste of what Al has done and what's in the book, and perhaps pique your interest in what is a tremendously important field today and a very promising field in economics. Let's start with a definition, or rather a distinction, which you make, which I think is quite important, which is the difference between commodity markets and matching markets. Please.
Well, it takes a lot of work to make a market into a commodity market, but once you've done that, you don't care who you're dealing with. When you're buying a commodity, it doesn't matter who you're buying it from. And so commodity markets can work very efficiently. And when you buy stock on the New York Stock Exchange, you don't care who you're dealing with. You don't care whether they've taken good care of those shares before you bought them. They don't worry about whether you'll take good care of those shares. And the job of the New York Stock Exchange is to find the price from moment to moment at which supply equals demand. And we think of a lot of markets like that, but many markets don't work like that. And for instance, I teach at Stanford, and Stanford doesn't choose its entering class by raising tuition until supply equals demand, until just enough students want to enroll. You know, it's expensive, but cheap enough that lots of students would like to attend Stanford. And so there are all sorts of other market clearing institutions involving admissions and applications and interviews and essays. And similarly, Google doesn't hire its engineers by lowering the wage until just enough people want to sit in the cubicles. So these labor markets and college admissions and many other things are matching markets. They're markets where you can't just choose what you want, even if you can afford it. You also have to be chosen. So they're a little bit like marriage. You can't just choose your spouse. You also have to be chosen.
Note one thing he said here. Basically, with labor markets, those of us who took introductory economics knew there was something called labor, and it got allocated by price, and but in fact, we all know that's not the case. That it's half a matching market and half a price clearing market, right? And most markets are somewhere in between, right? Between these pure commodity markets and these pure matching markets. Is that fair?
Right. So I'll talk. Some of the things I bet you'll want to talk about are matching markets where we don't like prices to do it. We don't let prices do any of the work. But labor markets are markets where the wage is very important. But when you get a job, the first question that people ask you isn't, what's the salary? They say, what's the job? Who are you working for? What kind of match did you make?
Okie doke. Let's talk about, in broad terms, again, we're going to get to some very serious specifics. But for the moment, let's get some terms clear here. And one of them I want to start with is thickness. Talk about the thickness of a market.
So marketplaces have to do a lot of jobs to help markets work well. And one of them is they have to make the market thick. They have to bring enough people together in the marketplace so that you can find transactions that you'd like, and that make the marketplace an attractive place for other people to come to do their transactions. So one of the kinds of market failures that you sometimes see is that not everyone admires a thick market. Employers like to be able to choose from lots of potential employees. Potential employees like to be able to choose from lots of jobs, but not everyone wants to be on the market at the same time as their competitors. So sometimes there are markets now, like the market for law school graduates who want to be appellate court clerks. They will get a single offer 2 years before they graduate, and that's what will determine what job they have. They don't get to consider lots of different jobs at the same time.
So essentially, it's a market failure. There's something wrong with that market, such that and the market failure here is that there are lots of jobs out there, but they're only going to get one offer. And if they pass it by that offer, they may not get another offer.
Right. And they have to decide to take that offer before knowing what other offers might be coming if they were able to wait.
And that's a thickness issue, right?
Yes.
Okay. Moving on. What's congestion?
So once a market becomes thick, the price of success is that you come to the marketplace and there are all these transactions that you have to consider. You might not have enough time to consider them. That's where commodity markets are so nice. In a commodity market, you can make an offer to buy or sell to the whole market. But in a job market, you make job offers to particular individuals. And while they are thinking whether to accept your job, other people who you might want to make the offer to if they turn you down might be snapped up by some of your competitors. Again, we're going to go back to some specifics, but I want to get through some terms which are going to get thrown around quite a bit. Another term here is safety. And safety has several meanings. Would you talk about those, please? Well, so marketplaces have to be safe enough that you want to transact in them. And that, as you say, can mean a lot of things. Medieval kings had to secure the roads so that people could come to market and not be waylaid on their way to or from the market. But nowadays, you also have to think about whether it's safe to give your credit card number to some internet site, or whether your identity might be stolen. And so we see new payment mechanisms like PayPal, for instance, or that are designed for safety. And there's also safety in revealing the information that you need to reveal in order to get a good match. A lot of what we talk about when we talk about school choice, is it safe? Is the school choice in your city organized in a way that makes it safe for you to tell the city what schools you would like your kids to go to?
Yep, talk about that a little bit, because that's a really good case where the market failure is pretty clear. Keep going.
Okay, well, so there were lots of cities in the United States that had school choice in a way that meant you would do very badly if you didn't get your first choice. Right? There were different ways to organize school choice, but many of them had the property that if you didn't get your first choice, then you would likely do quite badly. So it wasn't safe for you to, when they asked you where would you like your kid to go to school, you couldn't put your first choice first. You had to put as your first choice the best school that you thought you could get if you stated it as your first choice. And that makes it hard to give you what you want if it's not safe for you to tell the city what you want.
Gotcha. Likewise, could you see strategic behavior working in colleges where you try to fool the college into believing you're a first choice?
Well, some colleges make it are pretty tough about that. So many of our colleges in the United States have what's called binding early decision, where you have to you can apply early, but only to one college, and you have to basically sign a contract that says you will come if admitted. Other colleges have what's called single choice early action. You don't have to sign a contract, but your high school will only send one early application on your behalf. So quite a few colleges admit more than half their classes through some kind of early decision, and that's meant to cause you to say that they are your first choice. And of course, it's not necessarily wise to apply early to your first choice, because you might get more bang for the buck by applying early to some college that you think you can get into if you apply as your first choice, but not otherwise.
What you're suggesting is that there's not always a market design that produces an optimal result for anybody.
Well, not all markets work as well as they should. Markets are ancient human artifacts. People have been building markets for a long time, and often we tweak them by trial and error, and that can be a long, time-consuming process during which lots of inefficiencies result. And so while market design is this ancient human activity, it's a relatively new part of economics, as economists start to understand enough about marketplaces to sometimes help speed up that process of trial and error.
It's also not entirely clear that every actor in the marketplace wants an efficient market. Is that fair?
That's certainly fair. You can profit from the inefficiency of markets.
Again, this isn't an exam, but give us an example, because I think I'm allowing this to get too theoretical, and you're not.
Okay. Well, one of the markets that my colleagues and I helped redesign was the market for new gastroenterologists. So many of you in the audience are old enough to know what gastroenterologists do. The rest of you don't worry about it. But they have to do fellowships after they've done internal medicine residencies. And one of the ways that market failed was it stopped being thick. It broke down in a way that caused gastroenterologists to be hired 2 years before they finished their residency.
Because there was an arms race, because people
Yes.
kept being asked earlier and earlier?
There was an arms race, and so you might think that you would wait until you could see who was going to be a good internist, but then discover that the good internist had already been hired. So next year you would resolve to go earlier. And that caused the market for gastroenterologists to break down from a national market where gastroenterologists moved around the country to a bunch of very local markets where they mostly stayed in the same vicinity, the same hospital often, where they had done their internal medicine residency. So when we helped reorganize the market, we helped recreate a national market. But as you say, that doesn't necessarily lift all boats equally. The people who were harmed by that were the people who ran mediocre quality gastroenterology fellowship programs at hospitals that had first-rate internal medicine residency programs. Because when the market was broken down and local, they got to hire the fine internists from their hospital. And when the market became national, those fine internists went to better gastroenterology programs.
So there are wheels within wheels. Sometimes it's simply hard to figure out a set of rules that will make the market that will make the market work. And sometimes, even if you can figure out those rules, there are enough players in the market who don't want the rules to work to break the thing apart.
Absolutely. Markets involve careers and interests and big parts of the economy. And so, so as a market designer, often the opportunities arise in markets that are working so badly that almost everyone would like to see a change.
Those are the ones, right. Those are the easy, not necessarily easy, but those are the ones where everybody was happy to have you around.
Yes.
They're
rare, worth looking for.
Rare. Well, a particular case which fascinated me in the book is the market for the judges market for clerks. Talk a little bit about how that works. These are federal. These are largely federal.
So appellate judges are allowed to hire clerks. This is a market where salary doesn't do anything. Congress sets the salary. And one of the ways judges compete with each other to hire good clerks is by trying to hire them earlier and earlier, because there are prestige rankings of circuit courts and of individual judges on the circuit courts. But as a result, today, if you know someone who is about to graduate from law school this month and go work as a clerk, they likely have had that job already for 2 years, which means that judges had to hire them before knowing how successful they would be in law school. And they had to agree to go work for a judge before knowing whether they were going to get married in the next 2 years, or whether they would want to practice a different kind of law than they imagined when they had just completed 1 year of law school.
Yes, you've got an anecdote in the book about a young law graduate who gets on an airplane. Do tell us, because it's very funny.
Right. So judges make exploding offers. They make offers that don't stay open very often, partly because they've learned that if they leave the offer open very long, some other judge might hire you. So we have a story about a young man who had interviewed in Boston for a clerkship, and then he rushed to Logan Airport and got on an airplane to fly to New York and interview for a judge there. And when he got on the airplane, when they closed the door, he turned off his telephone. And when he got off the airplane, when the airplane landed, he turned on his telephone and he found 3 messages from the judge in Boston. The first message offered him a job. The second message said that he really had to answer very soon. The judge couldn't wait. And the third message told him that the judge couldn't wait and the offer was withdrawn.
So essentially, this was a market.
He was in the air for 40 minutes.
Okay, so now we have this market. This is worth continuing, I think. Surely you could do something about this. Somebody could make a rule, right? That you have to, when you make an offer, you can't make an offer before date X, and you have to leave it open for 48 hours or something.
So it turns out to be hard to make rules for federal judges. So there are organizations of the judges called the Judicial Councils that tried to make rules and have made rules like the ones you suggest perhaps a dozen times in the last 30 years. And the reason they get to make them so often is pretty soon the judges start to cheat.
And they cheat because for some of them the system was never a good system anyway, right? They're the winners in a free-for-all.
Well, so loosely speaking, the most prestigious circuit is the DC circuit. So if you're sitting out here in the Ninth Circuit in California, you've got a great job to offer someone. But if you wait until they're far along in law school, and if everyone makes offers at the same time, then the very best students, the editors of law reviews, will likely go to the DC circuit. But if you make an offer a day before offers are supposed to be made, and you make an exploding offer, then there's a good chance you can get those guys.
And the meaning of exploding offer is one with a very short interval for yes or no, right?
Yes.
Which basically destroys the thickness of the market.
Absolutely. It means that they have to say yes or no to you before knowing that a better offer might be coming in an hour.
Gotcha. For the sake of time and other things, I would like to bring up the big one here, which is kidneys. Al is unlike any other economist I know, has actually saved a few lives, because he is one of the people who was one of the prime designers of the market for the matching market for kidneys. Talk a bit about where this came from and how it works.
Okay. Well, first, let's be clear. you can't buy a kidney in the United States or in most of the world. It's a felony under the 1984 National Organ Transplant Act, and that's a subject in itself. So there's a shortage of organs. There are not nearly enough organs for the people who need them. Right now there are 100,000 people waiting on the waiting list for deceased donor organs. So on your driver's licenses you have a little dot that says if you're a registered donor or not, but there are not enough donated organs. That's partly bad news, but it's partly good news. There are a lot fewer traffic accidents than there used to be. There are a lot fewer homicides. These were places where organs came from. But kidneys are special because you can also have live donation of kidneys. So you each have 2 kidneys, and if you're as healthy as I hope you are, you could remain healthy with just one. And that means if someone you love is dying from kidney failure, end-stage renal disease, you could give them a kidney and save their life. But sometimes you're healthy enough to give a kidney, but you can't give it to the person you love because kidneys have to be matched. They have to be biologically compatible. So it could be that you're healthy enough to give someone a kidney, there's someone you love who needs a kidney, but you can't give them a kidney. And that's where kidney exchange comes in. It could be that you're in that situation and so am I. I love someone and want to give them a kidney, but can't. But maybe I can give your patient my kidney and you can give my patient your kidney. And that way we get 2 additional transplants that wouldn't have happened otherwise and save 2 lives. So kidney exchange in the last 10 years, a little more, has become a standard mode of transplantation in the United States and is spreading around the world.
Now, in theory, it wouldn't just have to be a 2-way match, right?
Right.
In fact, there's no limit to how big a circle this could.
Right.
Talk a bit about that.
Okay. So
this is a really important piece of the market, right?
Absolutely. So what the National Organ Transplant Act says is that you can't give valuable consideration for a kidney for transplant. And we got an amendment to that which said that what I just described doesn't count as valuable consideration under the Act. But it still means that you can't write a contract on a kidney. So if we're doing the kind of exchange that I just described to you, or a larger one that involves 3 pairs, we always do the surgeries simultaneously, literally simultaneously. So the patients are prepped and anesthetized and initial incisions are made, and then the doctors check whether everyone is ready. They get on their cell phones if it's in a different hospital, and they say, are you ready to go? And when everyone's ready to go, the nephrectomies begin, the kidney removals, and the transplantations follow. But what that means is even to do a kidney exchange between just 2 pairs, you need 4 operating rooms and 4 surgical teams available at the same time. And if you wanted to do 3 pairs, where the donor in pair 1 gives to the patient in pair 2, whose donor gives to the patient in pair 3, whose donor gives to the patient in pair 1, you would need 6 operating rooms and 6 surgical teams. We can do that, but that's about our limit. You know, I say we. My surgical colleagues have developed the logistics so that they can do 3-way exchanges reliably and with some regularity. But there's another kind of donor. There are a couple of hundred a year. There are donors who are non-directed donors. They want to give someone a kidney and they're healthy enough medically and psychologically to do so, but they don't have a particular patient in mind. And nowadays, they can organize chains that can be quite long. And the reason is the chains don't have to be simultaneous because you can organize the chains so that each incompatible patient-donor pair gets a kidney before they give one. So that if a link is broken, it's not a tragedy, it's a disappointment, but the pair hasn't yet given a kidney, so they can still engage in kidney exchange later. And some of these pairs are quite long. When you take pictures of them for newspaper reports, sometimes there are 60 or 70 people in the picture. And 60 people in the picture means 30 nephrectomies and 30 transplants, which is more than you could ever do if you had to do them simultaneously.
2 questions then. Strikes me. One is, could you make if you change the law, could you make the contracts binding? Wouldn't that solve the problem?
So it might or it might not. You would have to be very careful. The question is, could you ever actually perform a nephrectomy on someone who is saying, I don't want to do it, I don't want to do it, right? American law, I don't think we could do that. The other thing is that these long chains play out over a period of time, and sometimes chains break not for reasons of someone reneging, but because someone who is prepared to give her kidney shows up and they say, did you know you're pregnant? or something like that. And people's conditions change.
So the neat thing about the non-directed, a non-directed donor kidney is a really valuable kidney.
Yes.
It's a terribly valuable kidney, but that kidney cannot be purchased. That is, nobody can give a financial incentive to the donor. Is that correct?
It's a felony in the United States.
It is a felony. You mentioned the book where it's not a felony. We should know. You should know this, actually.
Right. So there's one country in the world that has an explicitly legal cash market for live donor kidneys, and that's the Islamic Republic of Iran.
And do we know how well it works?
We don't know. We're starting to know. They've only recently started to digitize their data, so I actually have some Iranian students who are looking into this. But we don't know very well how it works, but it does appear that they, you can take, I've seen photographs of places where donors advertise themselves. There's a waiting list for donors rather than for transplants.
Wow. Okay, now I want to try an experiment here. We're not going to actually do the count here, but I want to ask you guys what you think about making a market, or at least a regulated market in which you can be induced to give a kidney for money. How many of you would favor, under tough regulation, how many of you would favor doing that? And just to get a sense of what the sea of hands look like, how many of you would oppose it? So it's mostly, from my guess here, it's maybe about 2 to 1 against.
Right. Okay. Let me ask a question too. Those of you, just to give you some idea of how the debate is carried, those of you who would be in favor of a market for kidneys, please raise your hand again. Now keep your hands up. And would you be in favor of a live living donor market for hearts? Kills the seller, right? So, okay, there are a couple of free market economists here. Why not, right? If it's carefully regulated, but the discussion about repugnance, a lot of it has to do with the fact that people don't understand that not everyone takes their hand down at the same point that I take my hand down, and that part of getting a grip on this is to not just understand what you think is the right thing, but to understand how to start understanding other people's repugnance. What makes you keep your hand up for some things, not others. In California, we can buy the whole, not everywhere in the United States, but in California, we can buy the whole supply chain for a baby. You can buy sperm and eggs, and you can have a gestational surrogate artificially inseminated, and you can have your name on the California birth certificate as the parent. Now, there are many places in the world where they don't think that's such a good idea, but in California, it's legal. So, but in California, it's not legal to eat horse meat. We have a 1998 referendum that makes it a felony in California to sell horse meat for human consumption.
Well, no, I think this kidney thing is really interesting. I want to press you a little bit.
Right.
I believe in the book you mentioned the fact that, first of all, through a loophole, an odd loophole, a law says that everybody's entitled to kidney dialysis as long as they're alive, right?
Well, so Medicare, that's one of the, so there are 3 ways to get into Medicare. One of them is to be over 65, one of them is to be disabled, and one of them is to have end-stage renal disease. So dialysis, rationing dialysis was so traumatic that we federalized.
Congress passed a law.
Yep.
Everybody gets it, okay? It's very expensive, is that correct?
It is.
It's terribly expensive. If we took half the money we spent on dialysis and offered it as a bonus to people who would be non-directed donors, we would end up saving a lot of money and giving a lot of people something less than the miserable life they live on kidney dialysis. Is that correct?
I think that there's a good chance that that's correct. Not everyone agrees, and we don't have much evidence. You can't run experiments on this because it's a felony.
Yeah,
so,
indeed.
So I would like to see, to let the states be the laboratory of democracy and see some evidence gathered.
Okay, let's try the vote again. How many of you would accept that circumstance in which the recipient pays nothing, so it's not a matter of being rich enough to buy a kidney, and that the money comes from the savings you'd save from reducing the amount of legally mandated kidney dialysis? How many of you would go for that market? How many of you would, that's fair, how many of you changed your minds between the non-structured statement we started at the beginning? Quite a number. Which implies to me, and maybe to you too, that if this subject were actually discussed, people might actually change their minds.
Oh, I think that's right. On the other hand, the people who think that it's a bad idea to allow kidneys to be bought, what they worry about is that somehow, no matter how carefully we tried to regulate it, the poorest and most vulnerable members of society would be, they sometimes use the word coerced into selling kidneys against, not in a way, not in their interest. So, but on the other hand, what you just did was a little bit of market design. You started to think about, if we were going to allow kidneys to be bought, how should we do it? And you start to think about ways that might ameliorate some of the repugnance that is associated with buying kidneys.
So I'm an amateur market designer. Okay, fair enough. Before we run out of time, because I want to open this up to questions, though not discussion, guys. There are two other things I want to talk about here, because they're both really tantalizing things in the book, which I really, really want to talk about. One is an issue most of you know about, which was the subject of Flash Boys, the book Flash Boys, about high frequency, about trading, getting there first with the computers to trade. Talk a little bit about why we might not like that and what we could do about it. And this is the interesting part. All of you, I think, know we don't like it for some reason, but this is a man who can tell you what we could do about it.
Well, one reason we worry about high-frequency trading is it makes thick markets thin. If you look at very thick markets, like markets for Standard & Poor's 500 bundles and E-minis, things like that, thousands of them trade every minute. But if you're trading at a millisecond frequency, whole milliseconds can go by when none of them trade. And because we organize a lot of our financial markets as continuous double auction markets, that means that the first person to take a trade, a bid or an ask, gets the trade. And so you start to see competition on speed instead of on price, because there are millisecond after millisecond can go by when no one is taking a trade. And of course, billions of dollars have been invested in microwave channels, and before that, fiber optics, that to get information quickly from the New York Stock Exchange, say, to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And so right now, the turnaround time on that is about 8 milliseconds. It takes you well over 100 milliseconds to blink your eyes. So we're talking about very, very fast trading, not trading on a human scale. And one of the proposals that I talk about in the book, which is actually a proposal by Eric Budish, a student of mine who now is a professor at Chicago, is he says, you want markets to operate quickly so that they quickly incorporate news from one market and another. But supposing we ran batch markets every second, that once a second would be enough would be fast enough to incorporate news that human beings can think about, but it would be slow enough so that those markets would all be thick. There are lots of trades on these highly traded securities every second. And then you could restore competition by price, that is the best bids and the best asks.
And that would be cheap, beyond cheap, nothing to it, right?
Well, I mean, there are competing markets. It might require different regulation. Right now, there are regulations that require brokers to send trades to the markets with the best price, whereas if you were running a clearing market every second, you might not know what the price was.
Gotcha. But we're not going to do this, right?
I don't know. The Securities and Exchange Commission is a little interested. The New York State Attorney General is a little interested. So these are markets where sometimes there's heavy-handed, where there's the shadow of regulation. So it might be enough for the Securities and Exchange Commission to say that it would be okay for a marketplace to organize itself this way. Not that every market has to, but that you could organize your market and still have people send orders to you.
Where I was going with this is, if there's a fix, and we pretty much all agree, if there's a cheap fix and an efficient fix, and we pretty much all agree it's a waste of time to build these great microwave systems connecting brokers to markets all over the country, billions are being spent on this, then this ought to be done. But not everyone would benefit, right?
Well, the people who have built the fast microwave channels, they invested a lot of money and they were playing by the rules. So it might be that if you want to make this change, as with other changes, you might want to phase them in. It might be, one of the things I say in the book is maybe if you wanted to make a change of this sort, you should announce that you're going to make it in a year. And that way the guys who now own the fastest communication channels, that would actually be good for them. That would stop new entry on faster channels for a year, after which they probably didn't expect to have the fastest channel for longer than that.
So that would be part of the market design, the announcement.
Absolutely.
The announcement. So there are a lot of dimensions to this. Okay, one other, and then we're opening to this question, opening up to questions. Deep in the book, you mentioned, and don't spend a lot of time talking about, a company which I believe, a little startup which I believe you're involved with, called Bandwidth X.
Yeah.
And I was just blown away by the concept. I want to hear the man talk about it.
Well, so Bandwidth X is trying to do with Wi-Fi bandwidth what Uber is doing with people's cars and Airbnb is doing with people's guest bedrooms. They're trying to make the Wi-Fi in my apartment, when I'm not using it, available to your cell phone when you drive by, so that your cell phone provider might be able to smooth out when it has to build new microwave towers in order to cover peak load. And there turns out to be lots of dark Wi-Fi in the world, lots of connectivity that isn't being used because we were pretty responsible when we set up our household Wi-Fi and we put in a password. So when you drive by, you can't use it. But Comcast, which provides our internet service, might be prepared to write into the contracts that you could use it when it wasn't being used very much. And that might give connectivity that you often have trouble getting, say, when you're in a city with tall buildings.
So actually, this is one of these cases where it's hard to see who the losers would be. That there's no interest group that really has a stake in stopping this.
But it's a big coordination problem.
It's a big coordination problem. Gotcha. Well, so you'll know the name. You'll know that I'm not selling stock here, but I was just so blown away by this thing. And if it's in 10 years, we'd say, oh yeah, of course, we'll know where it came from. Was this your idea, by the way?
No. This was I mean, Bandwidth X is the company, and they had the idea and contacted me to talk about the market design.
Well, fabulous. Okay, I think we're ready to do some questions, and here's how it works. I'm going to read a question, and Al's going to answer it. Though he can read over my shoulder. I'm reading it because you can't see it, and we don't know who it came from, so it won't get up there if it's rude anyway. So don't even try. Okay, can you go over the market change for on-demand driving services, taxis versus Uber? How should it change?
Well, Uber is a pretty interesting service. They got the big, thick market that they have by ignoring lots of municipal regulations about who could pick up passengers in their cities. One reason they're as successful as they are is no one really regrets the loss of the local monopolies that taxis used to have. That was pretty inefficient, right? I landed in LAX this morning and could have come here with a Los Angeles taxi, but I would need a Santa Monica taxi to take me home. I mean, it'd be complicated for me to figure out what taxi companies to call. Whereas Uber, there's an app I could, if I weren't being squired around by a driver, I could call them up and it would know where I am. So we don't regret the loss of the taxi monopolies, but it's not clear that Uber will be the way that the market is organized. They just lost a court case about whether they could treat their drivers as contractors or whether they have to treat them as employees. So there are still lots of issues to be settled. But you can see that that's a case of a marketplace that couldn't have existed without smartphones. So just as eBay couldn't really have been invented before the internet, Uber couldn't have been organized before smartphones, because you could always call limousine services on a day before, call them up and have them pick you up for the airport the next morning. But Uber knows where you are. You can really call them the way you can call taxis.
Do you see any downside? I'm just following up on this. Do you see any downside in simply overriding local regulation about this? Are we better off or not?
Well,
automatically.
I'm guessing that the very recent old taxi monopoly was sufficiently inefficient that we're better off with Uber. On the other hand, it's not clear who's insuring you when you ride in an Uber, right? Uber is riding roughshod over a lot of these regulations. So if you wanted to be an Uber driver, I believe they would encourage you to not tell your auto insurance about this, so that if you just got into an accident while you were coming to pick me up, they would you would just say, I had an accident, and your insurance would pay for it. Whereas if you get into an accident with a passenger who's injured, then maybe Uber will cover you then. But I don't think that we've fully worked that out. So unregulated companies are likely to have some glitches that will have to be fixed and maybe regulated.
Okay. You're so reasonable. Okay, I'll read another question. Can we apply market design theory to help us select better political candidates that will be more likely to represent a larger percentage of their constituents? Good question.
Yeah. It takes me about 10 years to understand anything. And this is certainly a problem I haven't studied, but I think that a lot of the problem in our political system is the disconnect between how we campaign for office and how we try to govern. So when you look at Congress, they're highly polarized. And that's partly because when you look at the Republican primaries, the Republicans appear like they're going to have some primaries this year. You often have to appeal to your base. You have to say things that make it difficult to govern afterward. Greece is a good example of that. They presently have a ruling party that ran on the platform of not paying back their debts, which is a great platform. But then they came to the European Central Bank and they said, "This is democracy. We can't pay back our debts." And the central bank said, "Well, we're not going to lend you any more money," and there they are now. So governing is very different than getting elected, and my guess is that part of the problems that we have to do with that disconnect.
Well, where I think the questioner was going, though we're never going to find out, I think where the question was going was this is a lament for the loss of the smoke-filled room, where candidates were chosen by polls who were mostly interested in getting elected, and therefore were looking to represent, trying to get the most votes out of the society, not just to win the primary.
Well, I'm not sure I understand.
So essentially, the smoke-filled room, the motivation of the people in the smoke-filled room was quite different than is the motivation of the Republican base, of individuals in the Republican base.
That's true.
And perhaps more aligned with centrist democracy.
Maybe, although again, remember there are very different ways to organize. We have a two-party system, and that lent itself to smoke-filled rooms. There are plenty of working democracies that have multi-party systems, and there the processes are different. So, and today, we don't have smoke-filled rooms, but we do have campaign financing, and you have to line up financing pretty early, and not very many of us can afford to give to candidates in ways that cause them to be viable early primary candidates.
Okay, next question. What do you think of LAS?
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles' initiative of raising the minimum wage over the next few years. Do you have an opinion about this? What do you think about minimum wage? If not, tell us about minimum wages.
So minimum wage is a little bit of a complicated issue. If you made minimum wages very high, it would clearly have a bad effect on people who need to enter the labor force and get first jobs, and it would make it hard for them to get jobs. If you make the minimum wage very low, then you find yourself with working poor, with people who are working but can't make enough money to make it worthwhile to be working. Sometimes you find that. So a lot of what we're talking about is the same kind of thing that we used to talk about when labor unions were being formed. It's that there's some profit being made, and how should it be distributed? So minimum wages are a somewhat clumsy tool. You'd like wages to adjust finely, but in fact, as we look at markets, we see that wages are sticky. They often don't adjust the way we'd like them to. And so I'm not an expert on minimum wage, but it's not out of the question that raising the minimum wage can sometimes not reduce employment. And there have been some studies that suggest that well, certainly many companies voluntarily pay above the minimum wage so as not to have turnover.
You know, in a way, this is an unfair question because this isn't about, though that last, actually, you started something here which is more interesting in a way. This idea of paying more than the competitive wage to keep workers, that's a market design issue, isn't it, in some ways?
It's partly a market design issue. Again, you know, the more you're, you know, when you're hiring Uber drivers, you're hiring them by the minute and at the moment. But when you're hiring a chauffeur who will work for you for a year, you're doing something matching. You're hiring a particular driver, and you might want to pay your particular driver so that he's happy to be driving you around and not looking for other work or answering Uber calls while you're not in the car.
And in a way, it's striking. The whole debate about minimum wages is treating it as if it were a commodity market, strictly a commodity market, right? Which clears with wages or doesn't clear. So you have excess labor, excess supply. And you're suggesting that part of the subtlety of this is the fact that these are partially matching markets.
So they're partly matching markets. But as you say, minimum wages are related to the part of the labor market that's a commodity market. And where you worry about minimum wages being set too high, again, is people who don't have labor force experience who might be able to get it. I'd feel a lot more comfortable about that if we had functioning apprenticeship programs and things like that, other programs to help people enter the labor force. Okay.
Next question here. Can we apply this market design to solving social problems such as homelessness and mass incarceration? I think the word "this" is the. Can we apply market design in general to solving social problems such as homelessness and mass incarceration?
Well, mass incarceration, I don't know too much about, but some of it has to do with the markets for drugs. Right? A lot of our imprisoned population are convicted of drug crimes. And drug crimes, of course, are crimes that come from the fact that that we make markets illegal. And this brings us back a little bit to this question of repugnant transactions that we don't want to allow. And it's, of course, much easier to outlaw markets, to make legal markets go away. It's a lot easier to do that than to make markets go away. So often when you outlaw a market, you make a black market. And we've certainly done that with drugs. We did that with alcohol during Prohibition, a constitutional amendment. Then we decided to undo that. And of course, in the intervening years, we had all these colorful criminal organizations formed, about which there are some nice movies, but maybe that doesn't make it worthwhile. So that's a little bit, so when you say market design, we should think, you know, right now, marijuana is legal recreational marijuana is legal for sale in Colorado and I think in Oregon. Let's learn from their experience. Maybe we don't want to be putting so many people in jail for selling and buying marijuana.
Okay. Next question here. With a disproportionate amount of health care spent by a small percentage of patients, combined with a significant portion on end-of-life care, how would you regulate health care on the dimension of quality of life versus quantity and democratization of health care?
Well, those are good questions. And of course, it's been a giant political issue in the last years about how accessible insurance will be to poorer Americans. I'm not a health economist, although I've done some market design on kidneys and things like that. But the figure that says we spend a lot of health care on end-of-life care, normally we say that with some regret, meaning money is spent making death miserable. But of course, sometimes we save lives, right? Sometimes you're in the intensive care unit and you get up and you walk away and you go skiing again. So it's hard to know. So of course, when that fails, a lot of money was spent on end-of-life care. But when it succeeds, someone's life was saved. So as we get more prosperous as a society, I think it's natural that we're going to want to spend more of our income on healthcare because healthcare is really valuable. People live a lot longer today, and they live longer, healthier lives, and that's a giant part of what it means to be a prosperous society. So I think it's easy to misfocus on the costs, although keeping the costs affordable to everyone and making healthcare accessible to everyone is extremely important. But one question you could ask yourself is, how many people do you know who you think would like to have 1960s prices for healthcare and get 1960s healthcare? And often we like the healthcare we get.
Well, let me do a kidney question here for you. Would you be willing? Shouldn't we perhaps be willing to pay people to sign contracts in which they get something, money or better something else, in return for an absolute commitment to do not resuscitate. Isn't this the same deal? This is a...
So, you know, it seems to me that's a complicated contract. I'm not sure it's in the public interest, right? I mean,
Fair enough, okay.
that, you know, let me ask you a different question. You know, the real utilitarian question says, here you've got a hospital full of people who need organs, and you order a pizza, and the pizza delivery man has lots of organs. Should you be allowed to capture him and kill him and use his organs to save all those lives? Most of us would answer no.
Probably so, probably so. Okay, but I like to play the bad guy here. What are your thoughts on Bitcoin and how blockchain technology could change the global banking industry? These are terms. Some of these terms I don't know. Blockchain technology.
Okay. Well, so Bitcoin is a technology that makes public the chain of transactions, and therefore allows us to figure out if you own some Bitcoins by having everyone see what the transaction was that got you those Bitcoins. So blockchain transaction technology is pretty interesting, but Bitcoin as a currency strikes me as having many of the drawbacks that gold has as a currency, which is you can't make more of it when you need it. You know, during colonial America, there was a lot of barter transactions of warehouse receipts because there weren't enough coins. There wasn't enough coinage that people wanted to buy and sell things, but we just didn't have the money to do it. So I would have cotton in my warehouse, and you would have something in your warehouse, and we would write IOUs to each other and exchanges that made transactions more difficult. So one of the nice things about paper money, say, is, I mean, you have to regulate how it's supported, but you can have more of it when you need it. As more transactions are going on, you need more money.
But this is a classic issue where the value of money depends on the credibility of the rules governing it. Is that fair?
Well, that's one of...
And we would all agree here that absolutely locking it down, or at least many of us would agree that absolutely locking it down with a rule that said there shall not be any more money than the Bitcoins create, is less than optimal. But it's hard to write a rule that everybody would agree on all the time.
It is. But Bitcoin is an interesting asset, but it's not clear to me that it's a really useful currency for a global economy of the size of ours.
Okay. How does a prolonged strike, like the port strike here, affect markets when it's doing damage on both sides and to the wider economy?
Well, it harms markets. I was in Japan when the port strike began, and McDonald's in Japan started rationing French fries. They would only sell you a small French fries because apparently a lot of the potatoes come through the port of Los Angeles. So Japan survived, but it's clear that, you know, this isn't the way the market is supposed to work. So when a lot of the bargaining power of unions and things like that, or not just unions and monopolies, comes from these bottlenecks that they might be able to control. So that's one reason why sometimes laws about who can strike, typically we don't allow policemen to strike, because policemen would have a lot of bargaining power if they could say, you know, there's going to be free crime next week unless you raise our wages.
But you're pointing out an interesting thing. The power to strike almost inherently creates inefficiencies in markets unless it's just a threat.
Well,
and never exercised.
So lots of threats work like that, right? You know, when here we are conducting military exercises in Latvia and Lithuania, and presumably it's to keep the peace, not to, you know, a war would be inefficient, but you make the threat in the hope of keeping the peace. Or
of getting your way without.
Well, you might want to get your way without a war, absolutely. But I think strikes, like wars, are breakdowns in that process, right? That no one really wants them. They want something else, but sometimes they are tests of strength, wars of attrition.
Okay, I won't push this because we got lots more questions here. And is the increase in state college tuition to a level well above the ability of the average American family to pay an example of a redesigned thick market?
Gee, so I don't know what we mean by redesign there. You know, I should say about design, design is both a verb and a noun. And so when I look at markets, they all have designs. The design of the market are its rules. But a lot of markets are designed haphazardly. Their design has grown up through accretion of different decisions. So I think that's a bit what's happening with colleges. Certainly when you look at, say, the University of California system, which is one of the great American institutions that educated lots of people, it's getting more expensive than it used to be. Same thing on the East Coast. You know, City College of New York. There were generations of immigrants who were educated free of charge at City College. But of course, that means the taxpayers are paying for it. As we get more reluctant to pay for things with taxes, then we turn more to user fees. User fees in colleges are tuition. We should think about, so part of it is one way to think about it is price discrimination. Perhaps, I mean, the reason we like low tuition at state colleges is so that people who can't afford high tuition can still have access. But of course, the children of wealthy parents get the same low tuition. Maybe we'd like to have higher tuition for everyone, but generous financial aid for people who can't afford it. That way, the prosperous families would pay more for their education and pay closer to its value on the marketplace, while less prosperous families would get financial aid. Of course, it's easier to raise the tuition and then forget about the financial aid than it is to do both together, but a well-designed market would have both parts.
I would point out, by the way, that 20 years ago, it was sort of the average liberal economist's wet dream that we give everybody the chance to borrow as much as they need to go to college and then call it a day, because college was a good investment, or at least it was an investment that people could make their own choice about. And after all, if they made a lot of money later, why should they have gotten a free ride anyway from tuition? Now, that implicitly thought about a market in a certain way, and it was probably wrong, no?
I don't know if it was wrong. You know, there are some goods that we would like to encourage people to consume because we think it's good for them and for us that they might not consume otherwise. So supposing college was really expensive and then you were supposed to pay back with your earnings, maybe many fewer people would go to college because it didn't seem like a good bet to them when they were 18 years old, and we would regret that. Healthcare is like that too. We might think that people should get good healthcare when they're young, but maybe it doesn't seem that way to them when they're healthy. But it might be more expensive later if we don't make it easy for people to get good health care when they're young.
But built into that was a lot of assumptions about the fact that people knew what they were buying when they borrowed money to go to college, right? That was another big problem.
Yep.
What the quality of the college was and what it would do for them.
Absolutely. It's hard to assess the quality there. Think about medical care. It's very hard to assess the quality of the medical care you're buying. And of course, medical care, a little bit like college, is one of these funny markets where the people who you're buying the services from also tell you what services you need.
Okay, we're getting near the end, but we got a little more time. How do you distinguish thin versus one-shot markets? And does the distinction matter for you? Are one-shot game rules implemented in thick markets the equivalent of a thin market?
So I'm not sure. I don't understand the question.
Is this an exploding market? I think what one-shot meant exploding here?
Well, as opposed to repetitive. I mean, so I buy groceries every week, but I buy houses much more seldom, and I've gotten married only once. So it's possible that, well, but the marriage market that I got married in might have been thick. I didn't in fact marry my high school sweetheart, but you know, one can imagine that I would have. But you know, I married when I was young, and when the marriage market was thick, there were a lot of people my age who were unmarried who were looking to get married, and I married one of them.
So it was a thick market, just happened to be a very expensive purchase within a thick market.
Well, and one that I haven't made very often. But thick markets can be thick or thin. You know, I've bought a number of cars, and I've bought a lot more hamburgers. So there are markets that I am regularly in, and there are markets that I'm not regularly in. But that's a separate question for whether they're thick or thin.
Fair enough. It's announced to me, this is the second to last question, the penultimate question. In the California market for small and large group health insurance, insurers price their plans based on the rates of their competitors rather than basing their rates on the cost of care. What changes would you make to make this market more responsive to demand?
So more responsive to demand. It's not clear, right? In lots of markets, it's true that prices are based on the prices of your competitors. That is, if your competitors are offering the same thing cheaper, then you have to offer it cheaper yourself. Often that's the kind of competition that we want to see in markets. Now it can work the other way too, and that's why we have antitrust laws that it's possible to coordinate to raise prices, and the Sherman Antitrust Act makes it illegal to engage in conspiracy to raise prices.
So that's the distinction here. It's one thing to match somebody else, or it's quite another to signal. Is that fair?
So that's the question. Am I matching you because you're underpricing me and we're deep in competition with each other? Or am I matching you because you have a comfortably high price and I don't want to engage in a price war with you, so I raise my price to a comfortably high price too? Think about the market for gasoline, where people can post their prices right away. When you talk to a big company like BP, their gas station managers, if they have only a few stations in a region, their gas station managers have the authority to change their prices when the guy across the street changes his prices. But if they have a big part of the market, they have to get permission from corporate headquarters, because corporate headquarters understands that if BP raises or lowers its prices, it will also affect other people's prices. Mm-hmm. And so you could imagine you could imagine that BP doesn't like prices to be low. So they might raise their prices and then see if other stations in the area raise their prices too. Mm-hmm. And that's different than tough price competition.
It's my understanding that the airlines raise prices specific days of the week and then have specific periods in which they wait to be matched or not, and then lower their prices back down.
I think they probably worry a lot about their competition. And of course, when you look at airline fares, they respond a lot to whether there are other carriers on the same routes or not.
Okay. What's our last question? Okay. The healthcare market in the United States is clearly broken. Any thoughts on fixes, improvements?
Well,
you have only an hour and a half.
Okay. Well, that's not enough time. So the healthcare market is clearly broken. It's not an obvious candidate for redesign because it's clearly broken for so many reasons. And of course, healthcare is a giant part of our economy, so there are lots of institutions that have been built, there are lots of careers that have been made, there are lots of interests in the incremental changes we've made over time in different kinds of healthcare. So I think that the most promising place to look for redesign of healthcare in the United States is in large companies that are self-insuring, because a company that's self-insuring cares not just how much your healthcare costs when you're sick, but they actually like it when you're healthy and can come to work. And so the kind of things we have trouble financing now in the United States are inexpensive but effective things like nutritional counseling for diabetes patients so that they can manage their disease and not end up needing kidney transplants or amputations or dialysis. But it's hard to bill for what it really costs to do that carefully, to meet people once a week and encourage them to eat better and weigh them and do all these low-tech things that might have a big impact on their health. It's easier to organize payment for treatment when the illness gets out of control. So, but on the other hand, if you're a big company that insures your patients, you don't just care about the cost of treating them when they're ill. You're also glad when they come to work. So wellness programs, having gyms and health clubs and things like that, can start to be part of the same budget that healthcare when you're sick is part of. So I would think that if we're going to see innovative reforms, they might start there.
Well, listen, you have really been put through the mill here tonight. I really appreciate it, Al. And I think we all owe him a good hand of applause here.
Oh, thank you.
And I'd remind you there are books over there, and the books are even cleverer and more articulate than our speaker is.
Thank you both very much, and thank you for coming. Take care.
Oh, thank you, Peter. That was fun.